thank you all so much for coming to the space for learning, for mourning, for memorialization, and particularly to our event, Reimagining Struggle, the collective memories of the Tamil Genocide in Sri Lanka. It's just incredibly personally moving for me, and I know for so many of us, to see all of you here on this somber but important day. As you would have seen from the collection of really extraordinary materials outside, the Sri Lankan army massacred somewhere between 70,000 and 170,000 Tamil people in Sri Lanka now about 15 years ago, with the war ending 15 years ago today in 2009. 170,000 is just a number. It's so abstract, and of course it could be off. It could be off by tens of thousands in either direction. But each one of those numbers represents a person, and that was somebody's child, somebody's mother, aunt, cousin, a person with their own story, their own hopes and dreams and sorrows and idiosyncrasies, and all of that was destroyed, cut short on that day or those days in that 6-month period. So before we do anything else, let's just take a moment, let's take a minute and bow our heads in memory of what happened during that time. Thank you. So I have to begin with a lot of thanks. As you can imagine, the combination of things we have here today takes a lot of work from many people. I can't thank all of them, but I need to thank at least a few. First and foremost, this event is the brainchild of Dr. Nimigarinathan, sitting here in the middle in the yellow sari. She's the director of the Politics of Sexual Violence Initiative at the City College of New York, and a professor at that institution. And she's the one who first had the idea to bring the Sri Lanka-related archive materials from the Legacies on the Conflict in South Asia archive, which is housed at Stanford University, to UCLA to do an event here with this community to be able to observe it. And then what followed was a several-month-long collaboration, longer than that, actually, I think, very long collaboration between her center at City College, the archive at Stanford, and the Promise Institute for Human Rights here at UCLA, of which I am an affiliated faculty member. And we owe all of those institutions, those 3 institutions, our deepest thanks for making this event possible. Beyond that, a huge amount of the material being presented, I mean, all of the infographics, many of the pictures, and much of the other information that's being presented was organized by People for Equality and Relief in Lanka, or PEARL, which is a truly unique, powerful, grassroots human rights organization that was founded by a brilliant graduate of Yale Law School named Tasha Manoranjan. Tasha Manoranjan is the executive director of PEARL, was the executive director of the PEARL, the founder and the executive director for many years. The current executive director of PEARL is sitting here to my left. Dr. Madhura Rasaratnam, who's another one of our panelists here today. She has flown here from England for this event. After meeting also many people in Washington, D.C. to do human rights advocacy on Sri Lanka, and we're very, very privileged to have her as well as Nimi with us. Finally, I must mention that another person who is a product of the PEARL family who is here, and that is Mario Arodas, the last member of our panel. He was for many years the advocacy director of PEARL, and is now a PhD candidate at the university. Well, it's SOAS. So what's the full proper name of
SOAS?
SOAS, which is the University of London. Doing work, and well, as you hear, he has done just a huge amount of work on human rights in Sri Lanka as well. A few other people I must also thank. One is another person who works extensively with Pearl, Gao Nagaleswaran, who did more than anyone else to organize the materials that you've actually seen, the real nuts and bolts. None of this would have been possible without him, as well as our panelists. Before I go on, 4 others who I must say, because it's really an extraordinary collection of materials. Parthy Parthipan, is he here in this room at this moment? He's a software guru by day and an extraordinary supporter of the Ulam Tamil community in ways large and small on at least 3 continents, from what I have seen. He supported this effort from the very beginning in both planning and execution, and some of the material that you see that was actually from the beach was taken, collected by and preserved carefully by Parthy, also by Mario, and by Nimi, as we'll hear more about later. The brilliant filmmaker, Callan McRae, whose film you saw next door, and if you didn't, we are going to screen it after this panel, kindly agreed to allow us to show that film in the next room. I think the power and importance of that work speaks for itself. Dr. Karnian Arlanandam, who is my father, understood the importance of the archive and actually played a huge role in gathering support for it from the very beginning, from its inception. He has worked tirelessly for justice for the Sri Lankan Tamil community my entire life. And I know you would be, you're pleased, or I hope you're pleased. He'll criticize me afterward, most likely, for what's happened here today. Finally, the person who made this event happen more than anyone else, more than any one other person, is the brilliant planner and organizer, Ram Gauri, who is probably not even in this room. Is he here? Because he's organizing some other aspect of it as we speak. We all had lots of ideas, but none of it would have made any sense without the logistical planning and work that he has done, and done sort of 24/7 now for the last several months in order to make this happen. So thank you, Ram, and we'll hopefully get to thank him later. So I was in the process of saying that there's a special person who's not with us here today. They always say the people who do this work stand on the shoulders of giants. The person I'm thinking of, to me, really felt literally like a giant because he was so tall. The person I'm thinking of is Dr. Nagalingam Ethirveerasingam, who many of us knew as Ethir, or Ethir Uncle. If you just indulge me for 1 minute. He was a graduate of UCLA in agricultural sciences before then getting his PhD from Cornell University. This man won the first gold medal for Sri Lanka in any event at any major track and field tournament in the 1958 Asian Games in Tokyo in high jump. And in the course of doing that, he went to several other major Asian Games and also the Olympics. He went to the Olympics at least twice, as far as I could tell. He also had to compete against Sri Lankan sports authorities who tried to exclude him from the Olympics because he was Tamil, even though he was by far the greatest Olympic athlete Sri Lanka had ever produced during that time. But the reason I mention him is not because he was a great athlete. It's because after he retired from that work in 1994, he spent 30 years working in more ways than I could name. We could spend a whole panel talking about his work to improve conditions for Tamil people in northeast Sri Lanka, including by living there. He lived for at least half the year, for many years in the early 2000s, in their splitting time between Kilinochchi, right in the heart of the Northeast, including during all of the time of the war, right up until actually he left in 2009, splitting time between there and his home in Southern California. He passed away a month ago, and I know his wife Juliet and his daughter and granddaughter and grandchildren were here earlier. I'm not sure if they're still here. You are. But we just wanted to acknowledge him. He was an inspiration to many of us, to so many people who do this work, and we mourn his passing and are really glad that you're here today. Finally, I can't go on, and we're about to get started, I promise, but I feel an obligation to mention, as I've said, we're very, very thankful to the university and to the Promise Institute for allowing this event to take place. At the same time, I'm also personally incredibly disappointed with this university's response to student protests over the ongoing mass killings, which I think certainly many people look at and think also constitutes genocide, that are happening now in Gaza. You know, I love this university. I'm very grateful for the opportunity it has given me and to put on space at events like this. But I've been appalled, just appalled by its behavior over the last few weeks, and I just did not feel that we could continue to have this event without mentioning that, especially given the obvious topical similarities between what we're seeing today and, of course, what we're here to discuss today, which is about the events that occurred 15 years ago in Sri Lanka. All right, with all of those things next to us, let's now turn to the panel. We're very, very lucky to have these three folks here with us today. And so what we're going to do is 3 rounds of questions. And I'm just going to go mostly down the line, except I'm going to talk to Nimi last, I think, in the last set of questions. And then we're going to have a discussion amongst us based on these 3 rounds of questions. I'm going to share some of my own reflections in response to those questions, too. And then after that, we're going to have a question and answer period, and we're very lucky that we have Dilo, who's here somewhere, who is going to moderate that Q. You'll hear from him in a little bit, but he's going to moderate that Q&A and kind of guide us through it when the time comes. So my first question for all of you is how you came to your work on human rights in Sri Lanka. And I guess I'm thinking both about your background, like your personal background, how you ended up why are you not on the island in a small sense, what happened in your family history, and then also how you came to work on human rights and justice for Olim Tamils before, we get into the discussion of 2009. So why don't I start with you, Dr. Rasaratnam?
Okay. Can everyone hear me? Okay, so I'll try and speak up. So, better? Okay, I need to project more, I guess. So, like many of you here, I'm Tamil from Sri Lanka, and my family left in large part because of the 1983 riots. You saw the image out there. My parents kind of decided that it was probably no longer safe to stay. The second step, I guess, to my journey here is medical school. So I started adult life in medical school, but then I was sort of politicized and radicalized by looking at the events in Sri Lanka. And it wasn't just the events per se, because my family history, kind of the experience of it, the way in which it was embodied, told me that this is a difficult history. So that wasn't the thing that really radicalized me. What radicalized me and what turned me away eventually from pursuing a career in medicine, which is obviously what every Tamil parent wants. My parents are both doctors. I was going to be a doctor. This was how life was supposed to be. What really radicalized me, I think, was seeing, when I was old enough to understand, seeing the contrast between the way the war was presented in the mainstream media and my own experience of it. So the way the war was presented in the mainstream media was that this was a kind of good, Sri Lanka was a good, slightly kind of, with maybe some minor flaws, good liberal democratic state, was trying to do its best, and it was kind of facing off against this deranged insurgency that just emerged for no good reason whatsoever and demanded a separate state, and was kind of motivated by just a sort of pathological desire for violence. And that was really all there was to it. And if only Sri Lanka could defeat terrorism, then it would be a perfect place. This was the kind of the message of the mainstream media. And of course, to me, this just rang completely absurdly untrue. And so my kind of interest was sparked by that. And it occurred to me that there's real power in representation, and that there's also real power in knowledge. And so I left medical school and did what I had wanted to do, which is to study politics. I'm now I'm a professor of associate professor of comparative politics at City in the University of London, as well as being the interim executive director of Pearl. And so my work kind of really stems from that. I research, I do advocacy, I'm engaged in shaping the way in which not just Sri Lanka, but conflict per se is represented, the way it's understood. Because in those representations is power. They enable or constrain certain forms of violence. So the representations that sort of sparked my interest, my kind of journey, if you like, those representations of Sri Lanka as a potentially good, liberal democratic state, it had just some flaws, whatever. Those were the representations that kind of legitimized and led up to the appalling violence that we saw in the film in 2009. Right? It was under the cover of those representations that Sri Lanka was able to mobilize the military capacity, the international support to do the kinds of things it did in May 2009. So so that's kind of, oh, thank you. that's how I got here, and I'm sort of, I guess I'm very pleased that I'm able to do what inspires me, or what really drives me as my job. And I think that's kind of inseparable to my own experiences of Sri Lanka and the conflict.
Thank you very much. Dr. Gaurinathan, or Nimi, my good friend, same question to you. How did you come to do this work, both sort of origin story and as you approached it before 2009?
Dilo says I have to hold this close to my mouth because I'm soft-spoken. Can everybody hear me? Can you hear in the back? Okay. Closer. So this is really, it's very special to me to be here today. We do a lot of events. I've been speaking a lot around the world, around the US, but to get to be here with this community, with my Amanapa and my sister and my nephews, it's just a really, really special event for me. The question of how you entered into the work, I sort of, because I'm a nonfiction writer now, I think a little bit differently. And when I was thinking about it, I thought about a house. I think about space a lot. I thought about a Tamil home. That's what entered into my imagination, because if you were raised like we were in this sort of diasporic pocket of Southern California, a little Tamil enclave, everything begins with the community. Everything began with community. And so I can visualize this house, whether it was an over-the-top birthday party, which continued the tradition from back home of celebrating despite there being struggles, a puja, or just a Saturday, where everybody was in this house, and you had uncles in one area, and you had aunties in the other, and you had the children sort of running between the two, between these two spaces. And I think from a child's eye view, of course, I couldn't see that there were spaces that I couldn't enter. There were spaces that were for men and that were for politics, right? And certainly from our hidden position, my cousin and I used to hide in closets to eavesdrop on my sister and our other cousin. But while we were sitting there hiding, we never knew that we were sitting on top of these basements that held all of our history. At that time, if I remember correctly, our big concern was who could pass a love letter to another Tamil teen, or whose plate was empty enough to put on the top before you pass the aunties on the way to the trash can. But I know now that this was a recreation of Tamil life, too, that was a form of resistance, right? That what happened in our childhood was this collective recognition of the community that sacrificed for us, right? To allow us as children to freely exist here in the United States. I mean, there was at times, of course, also this kind of reenactment of cultural conformity in America. As young Tamil women, we were meant to be dedicated to education and matched in marriage, sacrificed in motherhood, right? That all came with growing up in this community. Recently, I got to meet, and I've been very honored to get to know Mr. Satyendra, who is the founder of the Tamil newspaper, the Tamil Nation. And he is 91 years old and came to pick us up from the train station. Another one of these folks who are so dedicated that it overwhelms you when you meet them, that kind of dedication. And we were standing in the kitchen. He had made little sandwiches by himself, and he said, "How did you become you?" And I said, "Uncle, I was very young. I was 20 when I met the female fighter. And I met her in Batticaloa through the Visions program founded by Meera Padmaraja, whose sister is here today. And we were working with these young women in Batticaloa. This was 2001. And from there, it wasn't a career, really. It was just my life's work, that whatever these women needed as they moved through a tsunami, as they moved through the war, as they moved through being in internment camps, I became whatever these women needed. No, I was an aid worker, I was a researcher, I was a scholar, I was all the things that they needed. I do want to mention that I was fortunate to work with Operation USA, whose founder is here today, Richard Walden, who at that time trusted me enough to program almost $1 million into controlled territory after the tsunami. So that was the work that we were doing. But for me, this woman, the Tamil fighter, the female fighter, she had these possibilities of power, right? When I saw her, when I met her, she was kind of tired of captivity to protect her identity. She traded the folded saris for fatigues. Even motherhood was kind of a commitment to reproduce the resistance, right? There was something in this woman that I was drawn to, and for me it's been now 20 years, and I'm still learning from the female fighter. Now I still learn from her. In the PhD I filed here at the UCLA library about a decade ago, I wrote a book recently called Radicalizing Her. And for me, it wasn't about coming to the West and saying, oh, you have to include women, you have to include Tamil women. It was a very different thing. It was saying, if you hold up the Tamil female fighter, there are things that you can learn from her. There are things, the limitations of our understanding, our imagination on gender and power and politics. She doesn't have those restrictions. We should be learning from these women. So it was 5 years ago, the materials that you saw here today, Dr. Angana Chatterjee approached me and asked if I would be the lead scholar on this archive. And at the moment, I was consumed with this urgent work, what felt urgent, of a political crisis here. I was working with immigrant women to organize against Donald Trump. But then I realized the generation who defined the movement were beginning to die, right? And we were losing the materials. And worse, every time we went back to Sri Lanka, the material proof of the violence was all at risk, right? We had these CDs of names that disappeared that one father had been collecting for almost 30 years, that we had supported him in Jaffna. And we went back, and he, because he was under threat, had left and gone to Kenya. And the new person who came said, no, I just destroyed him because the government came and I wasn't sure, so I just destroyed it, right? So these things were all at risk, and it did feel urgent. And I've been thinking, because of Palestine, a lot about Edward Said, who said part of the main plan of imperialism is that the empire says, we will give you your history, we will write it for you, we will reorder the past. What's more truly frightening is the defacement, the mutilation, and ultimately the eradication of history. And that's what it felt like we were coming close to. We were going to lose all of this. So I became this kind of accidental archivist. No, it's not something I trained to be. It's not something I intended to be. And I remember one evening in New York where two uncles had come from New Jersey, and Mario and myself had gone all over. We'd gone to London, we'd gone to Earlham looking for these materials, and then they came from New Jersey. And they came and they dropped these boxes in my house, and we went out for Thai food, because Tamils love Thai food. And when I came back, these boxes were in this small space I had worked really hard to have for my son and I. And it felt so overwhelming, like the boxes every morning, every night would sort of like both call to me and also feel like it was going to overwhelm me. I mean, this was our history, littered across this tiny one-bedroom apartment in the Bronx. So when we would sit with them, Mario would come and we would spend like 2 or 3 hours, just going through one box, right? We would get lost in them for days. We got lost in the materials and everything that was there. There were these like bent photos of Tamil women protesting in bell-bottoms in front of the White House, stuffed in between VHS recordings of what happened during the war. There was the stenciled artwork of the female fighter. There were these revolutionary pamphlets that used to circulate that were now just sitting in these boxes. So for me, I felt this burden of these materials that were so meaningful, at once very meaningful, but also needed somebody to assign meaning to them, right? And I have to say that today, even in the first hour of this, I have felt that burden sort of dissipate, right? Watching all of you look at the materials, it felt like it's no longer mine, it's no longer on me, that this has been shared with the community, And for me, I was definitely looking for the markers of Tamil women, the markers of Tamil women in history. And that's largely what my work has been. And I'll just quote, to end from this part, one of the booklets that was there was, as the men were writing the history, this one elder uncle wrote, how the Tamil woman, who was a docile, meek, peace-loving member of the Tamil society, turned out to be such a courageous, bold, and sacrificing person, offering herself to fight injustice and save the Tamil nation, is really unbelievable, but it's true. And I thought of that. These archival materials came into my head, came to life as I was watching the Tamil women in Trincomalee last week being dragged for serving kanji. You know? All of this comes to light in the contemporary moment. So I want to see, coming to this work, the history was handed to me by the uncles, and my Appa is for sure my biggest fan. But I found my role in the struggle through the female fighter.
Thank you so much, Nimi, for that powerful explanation. I just want to say two quick things to build on what you said before we turn to you, Mario. One is the reference to women in Bataclo being dragged for serving kanji has to do with the fact that the serving of kanji, which we were doing in the porch, obviously, is a ritualized memorial of what happened in 2009, and the Sri Lankan government represses it. And so they army and police in different parts of the country actually during this time actually arrest people for trying to serve kanji in Sri Lanka. The other thing that you said about the archive makes me want to just say one other small thing, which I know Parthy had wanted to say also. We know that there are lots of other people who have other materials out there, which I'm sure would be of extreme interest to the broader Tamil community and to history. And so if that is true, right, I think this is fair, right, to say you can get in touch with Nimi because there's a real interest in collecting and archiving this material here. There are other groups also. Newlaham Foundation is doing this work as well, but there's definitely an interest in doing that. So don't, if you're wondering what to do with the stuff that you have that you think is really important, do that. So Mario, same question to you. Speaking before 2009, how did you come to this work? And I know you have some very interesting stories to share about how that happened.
Yeah, thank you again. Can you hear me? I can speak a bit louder, I think. I mean, it's incredible to see this many people here, and I think the fact that this is happening in Southern California is something I want to touch upon too, because I think the way I grew up, the diversity of our experience, I think there's something we can learn from each other. And when we first discussed the format of this panel, and that it will be about talking about our individual journeys towards the struggle, I wasn't really sure. I was a bit uncomfortable about talking about myself because, especially on this day, this day is usually marked as a collective. If you look at the news today, you see how it's done back home. And I don't think most of us working on the struggle, and certainly not the people on this panel, like to center ourselves and center our experience. But when we speak amongst ourselves in private, when we have hour-long discussions over many years, when we're sharing our experiences of how we became to be part of the struggle, and it becomes very clear that it's not necessarily apparent to many people of how our stories can be very different, but also be very similar in many ways, and all of our stories are important. And having a background like mine, unfortunately, remains unconventional for an academic. I was born in Germany in a small village. My parents were refugees, and Germany has a tendency to treat refugees in a way that they keep you in a place for years. And I mean, we wouldn't even know that there were Tamils in California. And I think, Mother was saying earlier about, becoming a doctor and that being the Tamil thing. I know my parents also wanted that, but that was not a realistic option in Germany for us in the 80s. So even my parents, that push just wasn't there because it was about survival, right? And we moved to London and things changed. And I grew up in South London, in social housing, in a single parent household. And I got involved politically when I was 18, but it only started because some people from the movement came to our house and encouraged me to work with them. Being a poor Tamil kid in Croydon in the early 2000s wasn't really easy, and there was a lot of criminality and a lot of violence even within the Tamil community. And I was involved in some of that in my teams, and the social issues affected the local Tamil community in London immensely. Community events would be disrupted by fights. The police would cancel nationalist events, political events, blaming gang violence, and so on. And of course, a lot of the violence was driven because of intergenerational trauma and social factors. There were a lot of young men who had come straight from the war and who were on their own. And I've lost friends to violence, to drugs, to mental health issues. And I'm saying all this just to say, thinking back at 16-year-old me, I would have been very uncomfortable in the space of being on a stage, right? It's kind of crazy to think about that. And in some ways, the discomfort still surfaces. But overall, when I look back, or when I speak to some of my old friends who haven't been as lucky as me, I'm still astounded at where I am. And I'm not saying this, I want to quick to say, I'm not saying this as if this is some, I pulled myself up by my bootstrap story, as much as Americans like it, I know. But I wanted to share this today because I think it's important for us to talk about our diversity and how we are part of the same community of resistance, sometimes maybe even without recognizing it. And there are many who share my experiences, but maybe weren't lucky enough to have the familial connections that I had, for example, to the movement, so they felt comfortable enough to come to my house and tell my mom, hey, your son is a troublemaker, but he's passionate about the cause. We would like him to work with us and help us out with some things. And in 2009, I was then privileged enough to meet people like Madhuraka and Sulana, who were inspirational and showed me the value of our individual contributions to the collective. And it is about the collective. And of course, there are divisions and there are fissures, along the lines of class, caste, and gender. But the struggle also enabled connections and opportunities across these fissures. And I never would have thought I'd be a writer. But meeting Madhuraka and Sudhana in 2009, being trained and mentored by them allowed me to become a writer for the Tamil Guardian and eventually be an editor. And like most other activists, I was doing this work on top of a full-time job. But again, thanks to meeting Tasha Manoranjan from Pearl at the Human Rights Council, I was able to work on the struggle full-time, and I moved to DC. I moved to DC in 2015 to take on a full-time position with Pearl. And I realized that this is what I wanted to do full-time. Like, this is what I wanted to do with my life. But when Pearl had to let me go due to some funding issues during COVID, again, I had people like Nimi, Madhuraka, and Sudhana pushing me to do a PhD. And I remember the first time Nimi brought it up, we laughed, or I laughed, and I was like, no, this isn't going to happen. I didn't think I was an academic. I didn't believe that I could do it. But here I am, hopefully finishing this summer. And again, hopefully. Again, I know Kirtika's watching at home like, what? Hopefully, no, definitely. Again, I'm not saying all this because, I think I'm the main character in this, but I think it's important for us to talk about how the struggle also nurtures. And I'm privileged enough to have been able to take advantage of that, and I hope sharing this will help others too.
Thank you very much, Mario, for that explanation. Now let's turn our attention to the time of 2009 itself. Can folks still hear me in the back? Yeah. Let's turn our attention to 2009 itself and remember back. It's not easy, especially after watching the film. But let's go back and try to remember. And I'm happy to go first, but then I want each of us to try and remember what we were doing during that time. For me, I still remember, I was not, whether fortunate or unfortunate, depending on how you think of it, I did not, and still don't, I have a day job, which at the time was doing immigrants' rights litigation for the ACLU. But I remember what was happening in 2009 in Sri Lanka very, very clearly. I was, and still am actually, general counsel for a medical organization. It's a very small medical NGO called International Medical Health Organization, the IMHO. And they were trying to get humanitarian relief into Sri Lanka during this time. And I remember that there was this fight that broke out in, I mean, as you say, this is a framing dispute about the number of people who were in Kilinochchi, Vanni, basically the area that became the subject of the genocide during that time. The government was claiming that there were only something like 75,000 people there when the real number was more like 400,000. And this was because they were using food as a weapon of war and trying to justify why it was okay not sending much more food into the area. But we were hearing through sources like Tamil Guardian and other people who were getting information directly from the ground that there were children dying of malnutrition because mothers couldn't produce enough milk during that time. And one thing I remember was working so hard to try and get the IMHO clearance to send medicine and oral rehydration solution into that area, despite it being area that was controlled by the LTTE, because of course it was a crime, just as it is now, to provide material support to the LTTE because it was a designated terrorist organization. I also remember, trying for a long time to do these things, like how powerless and small it felt in the face of the news and this information about tens of thousands and tens of thousands more and tens of thousands more people being killed. I remember watching the clip which is in the film about watching the Sri Lankan government come and say it's a humanitarian rescue operation. At one point they said no civilians had been killed. And then they said like 10 civilians had been killed, things like, while just lying through their teeth while thousands of people were dying. And I had this incredible sense of being powerless and also being alone. I remember that. I remember having a conversation actually with my father about whether to go on hunger strike, because people were going on hunger strike all over the world. And it struck me that if I went on hunger strike, I would first have to explain to all the people I knew in my daily life, outside of our community, what I was even hunger striking for, because it was so small in the whole world what was happening to us, to our people. So yeah, it was a very, very difficult time for me in that period, and I'm sure it was difficult for all of you in different ways. Tell us what you were doing and what the experience was like during that time.
Okay, so I first want to say a few things. I think it must have been appalling for you to be alone. And I'm so sorry for any Tamil person in the diaspora who had to face that alone, because it's unbearable, and that you had the resilience to still try something is it's quite astonishing. Because I remember I have worked with Ahilan now for 4 years. Yeah, 4 years. So we've worked together for 4 years as members of the Pearl Board before I became interim executive director, and that happened thanks to Mario. But this is the first time we're meeting in person. But I had no idea that this would have been a Tamil experience in the diaspora, and it strikes me as almost unbearable to have to do it on your own, because although it is difficult, those of us in diaspora centres like London, we faced it together. And we faced it together amidst a protest, and I can see how sustaining actually that was. Mario and I met in the midst of the protests in Parliament Square. I don't know if many of you remember, but Tamils in London occupied Parliament Square for 72 days, and we refused to move. We called for a ceasefire. Of course, a ceasefire never came. Tamils in other places protested as well. In more isolated communities like yours in Southern California, people still tried in their individual ways. They tried to do things. So this was 2009. This was, I was in the kind of middle stages of my PhD. So I'd kind of progressed on my journey to if I can change the representations, I can change this. If I can just show how these representations are wrong and there are other ways of doing this, this can have an impact. Well, you would have thought at 2009 that would have been the point to go, that idea, that might not have, that didn't work out so well. But it was because it was in the midst of struggle, in the midst of community, we continued, right? We continued. So in 2009 in Parliament Square, it's inspiring, actually. It's inspiring that you tried to get medical aid all the way from Southern California, like we tried together in Parliament Square. In the midst of 2009, on May 17th, May 18th, we didn't have the graphic representations, but we knew this was happening. We knew. I mean, we knew this. We knew there was hunger. We knew there was malnutrition. We knew people were dying unnecessarily. We knew all of this was happening. And yet, what I found also remarkable about people in struggle, and I see this in the struggles that are now ongoing in Gaza, and I see it in the solidarity struggles that are going on in campuses across the US, in London now, in universities across London, is in that moment of kind of despair and bleakness, people find hope that there can be something better, and that I will act to make something better as well. And so for me, that moment was a moment of turning also, 2009, May 18th, May 19th. Nobody quit, nobody went home and cried. We just said, what next? And so 15 years later, here I am, and it's a kind of interesting bit of my sort of interesting in the sense for me personally, like this is the first time I've watched the No Fire Zone movie. I've never kind of been able to bring myself to watch it before because I felt that the grief and the despair would overwhelm me previously. And I didn't watch it. It's a British documentary. It came out in the UK, you know, it's Channel 4, it's well-known British broadcaster. And actually when the documentary was aired in the UK for the first time in 2010, I believe, 2012, it was a kind of almost a national event. There was a lot of run-up. There were questions in Parliament about it. There was a kind of, you know, it did have an air of a national event, not just amongst Tamils, but more generally, because it was a British filmmaker that was doing this. But I couldn't watch it. But I felt able to watch it now because I feel like through these multiple acts of not giving up, of continuing over 15 years across continents, in large collectives, in small collectives, in various different ways, in these past 15 years, we have overcome to such an extent that I feel safe to watch it. So, I feel like looking back now at then, the outcome that the violence was supposed to achieve has just clearly failed. It was supposed to break people, it was supposed to break people's spirit, break the will, subdue, subordinate. So you just give up and go home. You just say, fine, just let me live. But that didn't happen. And so I was able to actually kind of engage with it in a much more visceral kind of way than I was able to at the time. And that was because of the continued struggle from May 2009.
Yeah, 2009 was a very deep cut, I think, for all of us. And for me, I think it was jarring, and I feel like my political self kind of formed around the edges of that wound from that time, you know, that fracture. So, you know, I think recently I was in LM in January, and whether it's the state trying to evade accountability or people who are trying to make financial gains from this sort of political neutering and saying everything is fine, and the number of times that I heard people tell survivors of genocide to move on, that you had to move on. And it made no sense to me, no? Like, how do you move on from something that constitutes you, no? That is inside of you? Like, those wounds are in each of us, right? Those fractures and what happened. So it's a different question that we think about, as Madhurika said, you know, how do we move from that place, right? From the place where the deep cut was, not how we mobilize from that place, not move on. You cannot move on from that, you know? And for me, those moments, 2009, if you think of the consciousness like a muscle, no, that the consciousness sort of ripped, you know, there was this fracture in everything I believed at that time, and it strengthens, no, after it rips like that. And there were these moments that left these sort of marks on my memory, right? Mine and the Tamil women there, for sure, different based on our positioning. I remember being the head of the Sri Lankan working group on behalf of Operation USA, and we were outside the UN in the final days of the war, and there was one of those gray, you know, conference call things in the middle of the room, and all of the NGOs were there, and the actual voice of the Tamil people was coming through the speakers, right? This is what's happening. Thousands are dying. This is where the bombing is. And the worse the situation got, the higher the levels of cowardice from the NGO community, right? Nobody would even sign a letter. They said they wanted to choose access over advocacy. They wanted to maintain access to the camps. I remember the moment where the head of the UN High Commissioner of Refugees was sitting in front of me, and he was telling me it was really sad when we left Kilinochi because the aunties were lined up on the road and you almost had to drive over their saris. You know, this is the head of the refugee committee. I remember sitting in front of Samantha Power, sitting in front of Ban Ki-moon, coming to them armed with all of this information that they had all of us running to gather for them, right? Sucking up all of the political energy, all of the momentum of the resistance, not realizing that we were really just bumping into each other. We were never coming up against the state, right? They were never going to do anything with this information because they knew that China would block this or Russia would block this or whatever it is. There was a woman in Colombia who is with the Muslim disappeared, and she said in a study a friend of mine wrote, she said, "It's all a trick. Do you know how many rights to petition I have filed? I could practically be a lawyer. They, the state, don't care. They just want the victims running around filling out forms until they die." And this is important to me that even, especially with Palestine right now, even in the midst of their genocide, we followed their rules. And that's what we did in 2009, right? The recent book coming out from Marialam, you see the way that these moments, when you ask these women to move on, how genocide imprints on the psyche in ways that are both mundane and extraordinary, right? They describe an able body flailing in vain to escape the flames that engulfed them. They remember the red-colored window of the Sri Lanka Transport Board bus that framed the face of their husband right before they took him away, and now haven't seen him since then, right? These imprint on the memory, these images, and you cannot move on from that. There's nothing to move on from there. They talked about the cultural markers that were repurposed to protect, right? The saris that were ripped apart to fill with sand or used for a laceration as a bandage. So for these, the ones who lost everything, memory is this one terrain that they should not have to cede to anybody, who wants to manage that memory for them. So for me, as we look at Palestine right now, 2009 was the first for the empire, for the US empire in particular, what a friend of mine calls a stress test, of who our allies were, what the values were, was there any moral courage? And it was like the empire unmasked revealed complete moral bankruptcy, as they are in Palestine now. And I think what stayed with me from that moment, as the facade fell, everything I had learned, the human rights language, the liberal discourse, everything that we thought to be true, whiteness became very visible. And this is a conversation that we don't have enough in the Tamil community. But this is what was happening, right? The empire's intent sometimes is more visible in non-intervention than it is in intervention. Again, Palestine, Sri Lanka. Why did they not intervene to save the Tamils? I remember the policy group I worked for, the International Crisis Group. We met the day after May 18th, and they were already trying to manage the memory, telling us that we shouldn't use the flag to commemorate, right? That is whiteness, right? For me, I remember, recognizing the language, this narrative captivity of words like the disappeared, right? That came from Chile, went to Mexico, went to Sri Lanka on the placards of these protesting mothers, who some of them have died waiting for their husbands, loved ones, who were abducted or killed. Nobody has disappeared. The language itself protects the state, right? And it's a language that's used predominantly by whiteness, right? And this is something I think the Tamil community, I hope, stays with them. I remember the French ambassador saying, yes, no, we know what's happening, but we'd rather finish off the terrorists and go in with development. This is how whiteness operates, no? And when I did an interview in the New York Times and I said, how can you call this a victory? This is war crimes. How can you call war crimes a victory? And they put in parentheses, they added for me, as an aid worker, Gary Naden does not support the Tigers, I think they said. So I was credible as long as I kept my distance from violent resistance, right? Even Al Jazeera interviews that we both did, they would take them and they would splice them and take the parts that they wanted to. That was all the way that whiteness was working. So I do want, especially in this space, push for, after years of sort of twisting and turning into the space that whiteness was offering us, it's only much later that I saw what was articulated in a 2008 movement speech that said, our people living in many lands are intimidated into submission by oppressive limitations imposed on them to prevent their political activities supporting our freedom struggle. And I've been rereading the speeches of my pater, the MP Civis Ethembrum, and this was half a decade ago. He saw the facade, and he said, I was very amused at the eloquent speeches made in defense of democracy yesterday in the Sri Lankan parliament, on the value of democracy, fair play, justice, and so on that mean nothing in this country, right? And so I want to say, particularly on this panel, as a community, we spend tens of thousands of dollars to hire white lawyers, academic advocates for the Tamil cause, more than that probably, hundreds of thousands. On this panel, you have 4 of the many who are asked by white lawyers, advocates, policymakers for our expertise on the Tamil cause. No? So something is wrong here, right? And so this, since 2009, this is a colonial hangover that we have to get over.
Thank you, Nimi. Thank you very much, Nimi. Mario, you were in London, and you were in a lot of protests. Tell us your memories of that time from 2009, those months.
Yeah, actually in 2009, I mean, as I mentioned before, I was politically engaged, but I wasn't really as active as it happened. You know, I was at university, so it would happen like on the odd days, on the memorial days, I would help out. But as the war was escalating, we didn't really, but the protest only started in around January, the Tamil protest. The first protest I attended in 2009 was actually a Palestinian protest. And because, you know, the attacks on Lebanon, southern Lebanon were happening at the time. And we were outside the Israeli embassy, and I saw a young Tamil woman there handing out leaflets about the Tamil protest that was about to happen. And then she was like, oh, you should come to this. This is, you know, this is also happening in Sri Lanka. I was like, yeah, nan Tamil dana maranundu, right? But it shows, you know, that these interlinkages existed even in 2009, of course. And then I got involved then. But there was a shift in about April, and some of you might remember this, when I think there was a point of no return where it became clear that this is going to be very difficult to get back from. And I think it's when the military surrounded the entire area held by the LTT at the time. And it was April 5th, and I remember I was at university, and this was my final year of university. We got the message, and, you know, phone calls were going around, text messages were going around. I don't even think WhatsApp existed at that time. And we met in a park in South London, and we plotted. We were like, okay, what do we do now? And we, you know, sat and we said we're going to do a protest, and we, you know, spoke to many organizations and coordinated, and we within 24 hours we flooded the streets of London. Parliament Square was occupied. 30,000 people, I think, were there that day. And for us, I think being there and seeing that on the first day, it felt like a victory in a way, right? Just the sheer mass of people, and, you know, people carrying the flag and protesting. It felt like, you know, there are this many people out here. We've you know, we blocked the road at that time. So we you know, broke the barriers, went onto the road, blocked a bridge, because we wanted to disrupt as much as we could. And we stayed overnight, and I think at 3 a.m. or 4 a.m. the police kind of just moved in and pushed us back. But we were on the news the next day. Right, and thousands of Tamils, you know, families with their kids and elderly, everyone was sleeping in the square in London outside, you know, Big Ben, the Parliament building. But we felt like, surely they can't ignore this, right? There's so many of us, and, you know, we're disrupting traffic, we're disrupting life in London. But, you know, nothing happened.
They did.
Yeah, they didn't. Nothing really happened. And, you know, looking at Palestine now, you know, at that time we were like, you know, BBC, open your eyes, and media, you know, pay attention. But, you know, people can see what's happening now, and still nothing's happening. Right, but yeah, I guess we were, naive, or we wanted that international attention. But as Madhura said, we started an encampment, and we were there for over 70 days. And every day we would, bang the drums and raise the slogans, and we'd also have like massive demonstrations, like marking. We would get the news while we were there, and so we'd get the news as like, hey, artillery attack, like 2,000 people died today. So then we'd galvanize and get people, and we had up to, at one protest I remember up to 200,000 people on the streets, right? With incredibly massive protests, unprecedented in London from one community group, right? But 99% of the people protesting were Tamil. And as the news from the island got worse and worse, we would, block the streets again and again, and we face a lot of police brutality too, and racism. They would say things like, they'd be, we'd sit on the floor, like on a sit-in, and they'd be around us, and they'd be like, oh, can you smell the curry, and things like that, right? Incredibly racist, and they attacked people. When my sister got injured, I had a friend who broke her arm, her arm was broken by the police. Mass arrest. I was also arrested. It was 40 of us who were arrested on one day. But we kept going. They banned everyone who got arrested from going back to Parliament Square. But of course, we were there. People still turned back up. But of course, this is I'm saying this is nothing compared to what people on the island were going through. But that galvanization, that moment, and we would talk to people in the Vandi. If you saw the documentary, you saw the so-called no-fire zone and all that. We'd be speaking to people inside there too, and they would tell us how heartened how happy they were to hear that these protests are happening. And of course, the war was lost. May 18 came, and the pictures of the leader were flashed across our screens, and it was over, and it was like a funeral, right? But as Madhura said, I am also very sorry that how alone you were, because it was difficult, but there were thousands of us in that square, and people were sitting in groups, huddled in groups, crying, because we also lost a lot of relatives during that time, right? But we continued. It continued for another 20 days or something after that too. And I think I was a bit cynical, I guess, and I was like, this is done. We lost so many people, and there's no. For someone my age, I guess. Since I was born, the Tigers were always a presence. There was always armed resistance against the state, right? So this is the first time suddenly, from one day to another, there was no armed resistance anymore. So I can see why some people also would have lost hope. But then we, as I said before, we were lucky enough, because I remember we were sitting in your place, and again, we were plotting, like, what's next? What do we do now? And I do think in some ways we didn't give ourselves any time to grieve. And I think, watching that again, I can feel it. Like, we didn't give ourselves much time to grieve. I can tell it with, members of my family too. We just don't want to talk about it. We just stay away from it. They kind of, oh yeah, you do the political thing. Yeah, no, we don't do this. And I don't think we should mistake that for apathy, but it's actually like we just haven't dealt with the grief and the trauma that we all, it's incredible pain that we went through. And that kind of makes, the fact 15 years on we're still here is something that I don't think anyone expected, right? And we're still doing this. We're still memorializing, holding these events, commemorating. It's incredible. But again, there was a movement. There was activists who kept galvanizing, who kept planning and saying, look, we need to continue to do this. Because, of course, once the war ended, 330,000 civilians were put in internment camps. So we always had further projects to work. We were like, no, this is ongoing, so we need to carry on working. But yeah, I hope that answers the question. Yeah.
Yeah. No, thank you. I should say I don't want to leave the impression that there wasn't activism happening in the U.S. There's nothing on the scale of what was happening in England. People protested in front of the White House. I'm guessing some people here probably protested in front of the White House. But I definitely did nonetheless have that incredible sense of aloneness that I talked about. I remember President Obama, no doubt because of a lot of pressure from people in this room and many other activists, made a statement on May 11th. He had this very short press conference where he, called on the Tigers to lay down their arms, the government to stop using heavy weaponry, and said there's a problem. I'm sure half the people in the press corps had no idea what he was talking about. Actually, he came out and said this. It is also true that something like 17,000 people died between the time he made that statement on May 11th and May 18th. So yeah, definitely I had that, and I appreciate both of what all of you said. I'm gonna audible here a little bit because we're past 6 o'clock now. And Dilo, I hope you're okay with that as well. But I think what we're going to do is we're going to combine. I mean, we're not, as you said, we're not done. There's work that continues to go on by all of us. But I think it makes more sense for us to talk about it in response to questions from the audience. Just because it's 6:07, and I want to make sure that there's time for people to ask their questions. So why don't we do that? Do you want to join us? Does that make sense? Do you want?
I'll introduce.
Yeah, you want to introduce him, and then he can run the Q&A.
Yeah. So most of us here already know Dilo is a queer, transgender, Tamil Sri Lankan American actor, writer, comic. His work ranges solo theater and stand-up, TV, film, plays, essays, and poetry. For me, even going back to the idea of the Tamil House, Dilo, in his being, in his work, he crosses spaces, he collapses borders, but he does all of this so that everybody is seen, and it's something that I value immensely about him. I have seen Dilo bring a crowd of aunties in a churchyard in Batticaloa to tears with laughter. Despite not speaking Tamil, nothing was lost in translation. There, I've seen him pack Toronto nightclubs and classrooms, giving every Tamil youth the opportunity to be seen. And I can say personally, Dilo sees me many times before I can see something myself, and is such a beautiful, beautiful presence in this world that we wanted to have Dilo's reflections on this space and to help him and have his energy guide us through a conversation.
Thank you. I'm really not that great. I wanted to just say thank you so much to the organizers and for all of you who have come here from near and far, all throughout Southern California and beyond. I came from the community in Lancaster. There are many aunties and uncles here who are indeed my aunties and uncles. Lancaster crew, you can raise your hand up in the air if you feel like it. Don't be shy, huh? Okay. AKA Sri Lancaster. So I grew up in this very loving, beautiful community, and so many activists from that community who have been doing the work for decades now. And I know that in 2009, for me, I did feel isolated. I wasn't even in Los Angeles at that time, but I'm just marking it because I know that while my community in Lancaster and while Tamil people are known to come and support when anything big or there's a death or illness, we gather around each other and we lift each other up and we're there to help. I know that as a community, I don't think that we knew how to take in this information, the end of the war, and show up for each other in a way that we might have needed. Like all of us live close to each other, and yet we might not have all gathered around someone's house. It might have happened. Maybe I was not invited. But what I'm saying is that this moment right now is really for us to hear from you about what's in your heart. You've been engaging with the exhibition and the pieces in the room from the war. You've might have watched the documentary, and you're here listening to the fantastic work that has been being done, but by people who come to it with only heart, like a whole lot of heart. Like that's the main thing in the front, right? And so I know that some of us have been working in the movement, in the struggle, and I know that some of us have donated. I know some people have done a mixed bag of all of that. And some people might not have known where to plug in, but have desired to. But this is just a moment for all of y'all to perhaps, you know, think about, like, because I think that oftentimes when we talk about our migration to the States, we think about those who came pre-war and those who came post, meaning 83. And I'm from a family who came pre-83, and yet there is something in our hearts that has a big scoop of that survivor's remorse, a big scoop of wanting to do more but not knowing how, because our relatives are there, or we've helped people come here, but we want to do more. And I'm sure that we are going to get to that as we keep talking and sharing, and we hear more about how people can plug in. But this is really a time for all of us to just sit in with our hearts, just kind of, because I know that it's a lot. Today is a lot. There's a lot of emotions, but it's just a moment to just sit for a second and think and reflect, and perhaps share with us your thoughts, your feelings. Maybe use this as a space for us to come together and support each other, since we all are here. And with that also being said, the uncles, you all are known to sometimes hog the mic. So we would like to maybe start off with another gender that is, and then we'll slowly make our way to the uncles again. We never forget you, we love you, but as I have now become one myself. So yeah, if anybody wants to share, please, this is your moment.
Yeah, just raise your hand and go ahead and ask, and we can hear you.
I just want to tell you, Ireland was before.
Hey, you're an uncle.
Just, my name is Krishna. Just want to express my feelings, what you were talking about, how small we felt at that time. Looking at this Gaza situation.
Here are the top search results.
Oh, no, it's okay.
I think maybe because it's in the feed too, right? So perhaps take them.
It's okay, I can talk loud. Okay, so what I was trying to express my feeling about what I felt at that time. Agilan was talking about how we felt like small, and then we looking at this Gaza situation, and then they have all the support in the world, they couldn't do anything, helpless, voiceless, and we even went to some samya, and we went and asked help, because we don't even know how to get help from anybody in the world. Even we hold prayers, and I felt like helpless, and I was feeling like very alone in this world. And this is what our fate as a Tamil at that time. I was feeling like, why can't the God come and help us? And this is what happened, and I couldn't do anything, and we all as a community couldn't do anything, and then that's what it is, and that's my feeling at that time. I just wanted to.
Thank you for sharing that. I should say that there's this moment you feel like, and there was a decades of nonviolence in Sri Lanka, some of the longest nonviolent resistance in the history of South Asia at the time. Then there was armed struggle, massive militant movement with army and even a navy, and built a whole country, an air force, and then that did not produce anything remotely like justice for Tamil people and led to the killing of tens or more thousands of people. And there's that feeling, right? You're like, what is it? The liberal order doesn't work. The violent order doesn't work. Like how? Like what is there? And I definitely I hear that.
Can I add something? Because we hear this a lot, right? About it didn't work, and I know I've spoken a lot, but I think it's important that we, when we think, we say the violence didn't work or the protest didn't work, but they actually did, because we're here because of that, right? If we didn't protest in 2009, I don't think we'd be doing all the activities, whether it's Pearl or TYO or Tamil Guardian, all of these things, right? So we have to look at these acts like the protest or the violence even as productive, and we've come this far in terms of building an Ulam Tamil national identity. I mean, since the 50s that has been going on, but especially after 2009, in a way, it has become normalized in a way that it hasn't been before, right? Like today we're speaking about Ulam Tamils and it's just normal, right? It wasn't normal 15 years ago in London. It was, people were afraid, right? Because of the terrorism ban and other things, so people were afraid. But now we have, so, I mean, I understand it. It feels very, very much like defeat, but also we have persevered despite that, right?
Sorry, I don't have an experience to share because I'm not Sri Lankan, but I just had two questions if you have the time for it. My first question is the film that we watched, the timeline kind of ended in 2019. So I was wondering, what is life like for Tamil people now in Sri Lanka? What is the condition of all the Tamil people that were displaced? Where are they? What's happened? And my second question is, as someone who's not Sri Lankan, how do you reconcile your desire for wanting to visit Sri Lanka with also wanting to support tourism within like the Tamil community that's there? So, what do you do?
Those are great questions, Ida. Thank you. Does somebody want to speak to? Yeah.
Yeah, so thank you for that. So the conditions since 2019 are that most of the people in the internment camps who were displaced, the internment camps were shut down. And again, this is one of these things, it felt like a defeat, but because we kept going, that pressure is one of the reasons the internment camps had to be shut down, right? They had to let people go. Now, it doesn't end there. We still have the next step, because many of those people still remain displaced, so they don't have access to their lands. The lands are very often, as the documentary shows, being taken over by the military for like farming, other kinds of economic enterprises, hotels, all kinds of things. But those people have not given up. So along with the protests of the Mothers of the Disappeared, that film said that they started in 2017, what the Mothers of the they're still going. They still maintain a roadside vigil, and there are continuous protests by displaced people from the lands to get back their land. It's also, I want to say, it's like we mustn't despair, because the purpose of oppression is to give. I know you are entirely entitled to it. You're entirely entitled to it, but we must also see how far we've come. So one of the things we were discussing earlier in terms of how far we've come is that the Mullivaikal Remembrance event took place in Mullivaikal. It was a community-run organization on the beaches where the people were slaughtered. The community remembered its loss together. They planted saplings, which is just such a moving symbol. And they had to do it because we can mobilize international pressure to make them let those people do that. Not everywhere, but in Mullivaikal. At the same time, the Sri Lankan state used to mark May 18th by an enormous military victory parade. From 2010, they tried to hold the military victory parade, and they would get all the diplomats to come. This year, they're not having one. There's no victory parade because it's just unviable. We've made the international conditions unviable. In relation to visiting Sri Lanka, I think that's a really excellent question, because you don't want to not visit, and particularly in the north and east. So I've never encouraged people to not visit Sri Lanka. But there are places you can stay, there are places you can go to, there are sites you can go to where your kind of travel to, you're visiting Sri Lanka, you're going to Sri Lanka, will contribute to the resilience of those communities and those people, including... Yeah, Sri Lanka campaign has a list of, so we can chat later. Sri Lanka campaign has a list of places you can go to, places you can visit, places you can stay at, actually, including in Mullivaikkal, where you'll be putting back into the kind of the economy of the victim communities rather than the economy of the military.
Anyone else?
I'll just add about this moment and Tamil women. I think part of why we're here is to sort of open this boundary of what it is to be Tamil, right? And to say that, like, it's not about what it is to be Tamil, it's not how well you speak the language, it's not how many times you've gone to the island, it's not who you married, if you married, right? These are not what it is to be Tamil for me, especially being here this past week with everyone. You know, being Tamil is like the conversation that's too long about which shrimp would be best for the curry. Being Tamil is, you know, the dark cutting humor that the aunties have, right? The being Tamil is the air kiss on the side of your cheek. That is what it is to be Tamil. It is also like an internal moral voice that's sometimes way too loud. It is intense intellectualism, right? And for me, again, looking for the markers of Tamil women, you usually don't have to look further than your amma. No, you don't have to look further than that for inspiration. And what's happening on the island now is I see that. I see people moving from that place who are young Tamil women. From January, a young woman whose father died in 2009. In the struggle, she moved to a camp in India, in a refugee camp. She finished her college, finished graduate school from the refugee camp, moved back to Kilinochty to live alone, unmarried in Kilinochty, which in our community we know how rare that is, to work for the Tamil people. And her mother stayed behind because the pain was too much for her to return. And so maybe that's what this moment is. Maybe it's a changing of the guard. Right? Maybe that's what we're doing here. There's 2 young Tamil women here today who finished graduate school last night, got on a flight to come out here and are leaving tonight just to learn more about the struggle. That is the future of the struggle. It is in these young Tamil women. So I think that I want to return to the idea of community, and what brought us here today is that we're hoping to breathe some life into the community again, to breathe some political life, and to tell you that we need more recruits, but the struggle is going on. And Tamil women, I suspect, are going to be at the forefront.
Amma wants to talk. Please. I just wanted to make a comment. I think this is a beginning, a good beginning, but it's still only a beginning. There's a saying that a person dies twice. First, when the life leaves the body, and the second time when you fade away from the memory of people whom you know. These unfortunate people who died in these conflicts, memory should not be forgotten. And so whatever you can do to expand this to the next coming generations so that they never forget what has happened. We should take a page from the Jewish community and keep the Holocaust, how they keep the Holocaust memory in everybody's faces. I think we should keep this memory going.
Thank you.
That's your raisement.
I'll try to speak without the mic. We all hear it. My name is Seth. I grew up here in Southern California. 2009, as a 9-year-old, in like the shopping mall, like outside of Banana Republic. Abba was like one of the organizers. We have a huge, like small community, but very active community, I think, that Uncle Lee mentioned earlier.
we should answer this, and then I think we should have Ganavia sing because just because of the timing. So do folks want to answer this? Thank you very much for that question. I have a thought too, but others should answer first.
I'll answer just quickly with an anecdote. I was with Adele Auntie, who is a big figure in the struggle in London, and she described again a Tamil home, and she said, you know, back then in London, in the 80s, 90s, we would all just sit on the floor. The Eritreans, the South Africans, everyone would come, somebody would cook, we would listen, there would be political education. Right, for me, I think partially the way the world has gone and 9/11 and all of that, we've lost some of that, no? And so a lot of my work now is to find that sort of through line between struggles in the Global South, right? To work on things like an idea of my next book is on occupation and the body. How does occupation sit in the body in the same ways, whether you're in Palestine or whether you're in a checkpoint in Sri Lanka, right? What is the role of sacrifice in the struggle? A big part of why we want to do this today is after 15 years hearing uncles sort of wonder, did we sacrifice for nothing? Hear the women in the Tigers, did we sacrifice for nothing? And the answer being no, you didn't, because this is still alive, no? But that work of like coming from a deeper place is what we have to do now. I think we have to rebuild a lot of those ties to struggles in the Global South.
Very quick observation. Pearl has our advocacy officer is in Mullivaikkal at the moment, and I believe Mario, you spoke to her. And actually, at the Remembrance event, they did speak about Palestine. So they're connected. They can't always show it, but they are connected. They spoke about Palestine because how can they not, right? But that work of coming together, finding linkages, we do have to do.
I'll just say very briefly, or actually, Mario, is there anything you wanted to add to this, or do you, no? I mean, I'll just say very briefly, I've done some work, legal support really, with some of the students here, and I was heartened, warmed to find that some of them were Tamil, you know, and it seems to me that, and also from other South Asian, you know, first generation from oppressed minorities in South Asia, and I have to believe that at least some of that is about people seeing so clearly the connections, you know, between these struggles, even though obviously there's lots of other people who don't have that background who are also, you know, participating in it. I'm sorry, I feel like we could talk for another hour, but we shouldn't do that. So let's take a minute. Last. Oh, do we have time for it? Sorry. What's that? You want to do that while we do this question? Okay. Yeah. Go ahead, Namako.
Yeah. Thank you so much. You mentioned about uncles and aunties, I think I can talk to my grandfather. My question, I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm going to start by sharing my experience, what happened in 2019. I was sitting there and thinking to myself all alone, and the question I asked myself is, what can I do when 80 million Tamils just 26 miles away from me couldn't do? I found the answer when I went to India. The answer was that we haven't made any connections with Indian politicians and Indian bodies. If any country can do anything, it is going to come through India. That's my opinion. So my question is, are you involved in dealing with any associations, politicians, or any bodies over there in promoting our cause? And what is your opinion about the role India must play? Because in my opinion, that's the way to what we are going to achieve, is to achieve what we are going to achieve.
I'm not totally sure what it means that I'm here left on the stage alone to answer this question. But I think I'll just say two things. We could have a very long conversation about this. I'll just say, for those who don't know the historical context, of course, and I know it from my time as a teenager, there were a lot of expatriate Tamils who tried really, really hard to get the Indian government involved in Sri Lanka, and they succeeded. And the Indian army invaded Sri Lanka in 1987. and then fought the tigers and lost, and also killed many people in northern Sri Lanka, and it didn't go very well. That does not mean that India is not a place where people must look to, but of course, but like so many other things, it's a complicated path that has been tried. I mean, the only other thing I'll say, and I know other people here in the room know much more about it than me, there is a lot of work, I think, going on to try to build solidarity with Tamil Nadu, in particular, the politicians in Tamil Nadu, but unfortunately we have to leave it there. Let's thank our panelists, I think, first. And now I'll pass it to Nimi to introduce Ganavia. Yeah.
I'm so thrilled to introduce Ganavia, and particularly for the young people here. Part of this is to be able to see that you could be a scholar, you could be an artist, you could be an actor, right? But we all find our ways of political expression, and Ganavia's is particularly powerful. I'll read her bio. She has populated jazz standards with lyrics from Tamil poetry and songs of anti-colonial resistance. No matter the language or content, Ganavia's voice is a thick ephemera, like smoke as dark as ink, just coming off the fire. That's in the New York Times. Daughters, sons, all being transcendent. There's not much to be said. You'll sit and absorb this music, but we're so happy to have Ganavia with us, and I think you'll see why she's here today with us, and we're so grateful that she joined us for this important day.
This is the second time I'm singing for a gathering like this, and each time I am at a loss for words because I'm not sure what I can do here or what I could possibly. And each time I feel like I was brought here because I get to listen, and if in response my offering should be to sing, but I'm always at a loss of words, and I'm always kind of dumbfounded. I went to school at UCLA as a graduate student and then left the program, I think about 10 years ago. And the fact that the microphones do not work for a panel that was organized, and that the volume knob is not accessible, says everything that I have to say about this institution. They had one job, just one job, so that we could hear what we had come to hear, which was not me. And not much has changed in this institution since then.